a great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Thom Mason, who is currently the director of Oak Ridge National Laboratory. He received his PhD in 1990 from McMaster University, and his field of expertise is something called condensed matter physics, which you may not know what that is, but he studies the properties of materials using particles called neutrons. And these neutrons always come from big machines like reactors or particle accelerators. So in his research, he has used these machines quite a bit, and even when he went to Oak Ridge National Laboratory, became associate director in charge of the construction of a large particle accelerator called the spallation neutron source. And that went very well. It uses these neutron particles that he is an expert at. And after being associate director in charge of that facility, he became the director of Oak Ridge National Laboratory in 2007. And so he has many distinguished accomplishments. He's a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He's a fellow of the American Physical Society. He's been a Sloan Fellow in the past. So it's a pleasure to have Dr. Mason here tonight and tell us about his reflections on big science.
This is a bit of an experiment because I'm going to give a history talk. It's you're here under false pretenses. I'm not going to talk about science. I'm going to talk about the history of science, which is dangerous because I'm not a historian. But since I manage a large lab, it's also true that I'm not a scientist, so it's probably okay. So thank you to the Science Museum of Virginia for hosting this and giving me a chance to kind of try this on for size, and to Jefferson Lab for arranging it. And as the title of my talk suggests, I'm going to talk about what's been known for a while now as big science. It's actually almost the 50th anniversary of the publication of a book called Reflections on Big Science that was a collection of essays published in 1967, and that was really the first instance where people started using this phrase. So I was going to look back on that a little bit and think about what we mean when we say big science. The dictionary definition is large-scale scientific research consisting of projects funded usually by a national government or group of governments. That's what you will see. I don't know if that's Webster's or Oxford's, but it's one of those dictionaries. The term was popularized by Alvin Weinberg. He was the author of that book that I mentioned, Reflections on Big Science. It was a series of essays that he wrote through the 60s. He was my predecessor, not my immediate predecessor, but a previous predecessor as director of Oak Ridge National Lab. He served in that role from 1955 to 1973. And one of the things that he did sort of in his spare time was he thought a lot about the broader implications of science and engineering, and a little bit about science policy and how decision-making should be carried out in terms of prioritization and you know, what an appropriate use of government funds might be in investing in research. And this came from a background where he played a key role in the Manhattan Project as part of the effort to build a bomb to win the war. And during that time, he was a young physicist. He just recently graduated from the University of Chicago with a PhD in biophysics, and was essentially drafted into the war effort. And in fact, it was a component of the Manhattan Project or its predecessors that really deserves a great deal of credit for the development of this model of doing science. And that's reflected here in this photograph, which shows a picture of the 60-inch cyclotron that was built by E.O. Lawrence at the University of California at Berkeley in 1939. And this was one in a series of machines that started with an invention in 1932, an idea that Lawrence had to build this thing called a cyclotron that uses a magnetic field to guide a charged particle beam and actually increase its energy. And his initial conception was to use these beams that were being produced to explore the nucleus, understand nuclear physics, and also the production of isotopes for industrial and medical purposes. And the first cyclotron was not big. It was about 4 inches in diameter. That was in 1932. But Lawrence realized that in order to be able to do the things he wanted to do to produce isotopes to study the nucleus and nuclear medicine and so forth, he had to scale this up. So between 1932 and 1939, you went from something about this big to something that a group of researchers could sit on top of. And this began to look pretty big in context. The magnet, and the magnet is sort of the cylindrical object in behind the gentleman standing there. This is Lawrence right here, weighed 220 tons. To do experiments on the machines, you had to have a fairly large multidisciplinary team of scientists and engineers. And the RAD lab staff, it was called the Radiation Lab at the University of California, Berkeley, grew from 10 in 1932 to 60 by the time this picture was taken in 1939. And it included not just physicists, but biologists, chemists, and physicians. And so this was beginning to have some of the flavor of what we now think of as big science, in that it involved what for the time were fairly substantial capital investments, large teams of people with different technical and backgrounds, all working on a big important project. Lawrence himself actually had to spend a fair amount of his time finding financial support in order to do this. Because prior to the Second World War, the US government was actually not a major funder of research. There were really only 2 areas that the US government invested in terms of research: agriculture and defense. And at this point in time, there was no idea that any of this work would be relevant to either. Although, as it turned out, it's made contributions to both. But that was not something that Lawrence had in mind as he was doing it. He was pursuing it as a fundamental science activity, trying to understand the origins of matter and the nature of the universe. And the spin-offs, if you will, that he was attentive to were mainly in the medical field. So he got most of his funding from the state of California through the university, from private philanthropic organizations, including the Rockefeller Foundation, and from private industry that was interested in the prospect of, potentially somehow, some way being able to make money out of this at some point in time. He did receive a little bit of federal funding, but it was really only the threat to national security associated with the Second World War and the opportunity that was presented by the understanding that you could set up a nuclear chain reaction that started to lead to significant federal investments as part of the Manhattan Project. And the Manhattan Project was launched formally in 1942, and it was focused on a single goal, to be the first to develop what was then called the atomic bomb. And that required a substantial investment. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Manhattan District as it was known, spent about $2.2 billion to create a national network of facilities. That's $2.2 billion in 1942 dollars. So that is a colossal sum of money if you were to try and do it again today. That national network of facilities included the first nuclear reactors. This shows a picture of the X-10 pile, or the graphite reactor, that was built at Oak Ridge in 1943. It included funding for the cyclotrons, and the cyclotrons were used to produce isotopes in order to measure their properties that were relevant for the design of the bomb. And it was also a crash effort, and in fact, multiple parallel paths were pursued in terms of developing the technology. Now, at the time, and we've actually, we've been looking through over the last couple of years the records from the graphite reactor. Every day, it went critical in November of 1943. It was constructed in 9 months. So they began construction in February. And this was the first real engineered nuclear reactor. The sustained chain reaction had been demonstrated in something called the Chicago pile, which was built in the squash courts under Stagg Field at the University of Chicago. And the reason the Chicago pile was called a pile is it was a pile. They stacked up graphite blocks and uranium until they reached criticality, which meant that the chain reaction could be sustained. So that proved an important thing. It improved that you could actually make a chain reaction. But it wasn't a real engineered facility. This was the first engineered nuclear reactor. It was built as a facility. And that chain reaction in the pile was done in 1942. And immediately work began designing this facility and larger facilities built in Hanford for the production of plutonium. So in 9 months, this facility was built. And its initial role was as a pilot plant for the Hanford facility. So it was what they called it a semi-works. It was an intermediate scale demonstration of the technology. It was used to train the operators for Hanford. It was also used to uncover some of the problems. Normally in the chemical industry, and this was built by DuPont, they were brought in as a chemical company that knew how to scale things up. You'd go from the laboratory to a semi-works, you'd run the semi-works for a while, and then you'd go to full-scale production once you really understood it. Because it was the Manhattan Project and the war, there was no luxury of time to do these things in a linear fashion. So this was done essentially in parallel with the Hanford production facilities with about a 6-month lead time. And they had enough operational experience from it that they were actually able to, at the last minute, change the design of the Hanford reactors to get around a problem of poisoning from fission products that would have disrupted the operation, and that had been observed here. So one of its roles was as a pilot plant. Another role, and not just of the reactor, but also of the processing to extract the plutonium that was used in the Fat Man device that was dropped on Nagasaki and also tested at Alamogordo. So in behind the reactor was the chemical processing facilities. And the way it worked was you loaded the fuel, which was in kind of beer can-sized aluminum canisters filled with uranium, into these channels, and you can see there are hundreds of them. They go into the reactor, fission happens, you get the conversion of uranium-238 into plutonium-239. You push those cans out the other end into a chemical facility where the plutonium is extracted. So it was producing gram quantities of plutonium in order to measure the chemical and physical properties. So those activities were very closely tied to the war effort. But when you look through those logs, and there was every day after November of '43, there was a short summary saying, here's what we did in the reactor today. You know, the control rods get stuck and someone had to go hit them with a hammer. The biologist put 500 fruit flies and so many wet mice and so many rabbits into the reactor because they were trying to understand the effects of radiation on humans, on mammals. And actually, an interesting spin-off of that work was a program in mouse genomics that was initiated at Oak Ridge that led to the discovery of the Y chromosome, which is the genetic differentiator between males and females. A pretty important fundamental understanding that happened as an odd byproduct of this war effort. And they were also doing other things. They wanted to set up some measurements to look at neutron cross-sections, so they built a neutron diffractometer, and as Bob mentioned, that's my field. And if you read the reports from that, basically they're saying, well, this is good, we can produce a beam of neutrons, we can use it to study plutonium and uranium, but oh, by the way, after the war, this could turn out to be really important for other purposes, and we really need to make a mental note to get back to it once the pressure of the war effort is off. So they were very attentive to the scientific opportunities at the time, even though it wasn't their principal focus. Other things that came about as a result of this were the discovery of new elements. Obviously, with the cyclotron, actually a fairly large portion of that bottom part of the periodic table that no one remembers was populated with artificial elements produced using the cyclotron, and that's why the periodic table of elements has things like berkelium and californium and lawrencium. All goes back to E.O. Lawrence and his cyclotron. Another new element was promethium that was actually discovered at the graphite reactor, and the reason that it was named promethium is because it was part of the Manhattan Project effort, and they had this sort of, you know, sense of Greek tragedy surrounding what they were doing that led to the name, although that work was not published until after the war when it was declassified. So there was a network of facilities that was built up as part of that effort. And in 1946, Congress transferred control of all things nuclear, both research and weapons, from the military. It had been under the auspices of the Army Corps of Engineers to civilian control, and created the Atomic Energy Commission. So the AEC was tasked with developing nuclear weapons. At that point in time, it was becoming clear there was going to be some kind of confrontation with the Soviet Union. Of course, that became the Cold War. It wasn't apparent exactly what form that would take in the mid to late 40s, but clearly the atomic bomb had been critical in ending the war in Japan, and there was a feeling that it was going to be important in whatever happened to unfold in the standoff with the Soviets. But also, AEC had a responsibility for developing the peaceful uses of atomic energy. And those assignments required the development of further technical resources. So the AEC created the national labs to take advantage of those resources. And in 1955, Weinberg, then newly minted as director of Oak Ridge Labs, I think for the first time, used the phrase big science. He called the national labs edifices of big science and pressed to use them for problems beyond atomic energy. So what sorts of facilities were developed? Well, they kind of followed the parallel paths of, in a certain sense, the cyclotron, the Berkeley cyclotrons and the graphite reactor. This is kind of the next step along in terms of accelerators. It's the cosmotron. It's a proton synchrotron, it's called. So now you've got an even larger machine in terms of the physical scale, and the reason is trying to go to higher energies. The push was to get to 1 billion electron volts. The electron volt is kind of the unit of measure for energy. And so the previous cyclotrons had kind of gone from kilo-electron volts to millions of electron volts, and the desire was to get up to higher energies, to get deeper inside of matter. And so this is a picture from 1953. And in fact, this machine was starting to get big enough that it started to get rather political. Where should such a thing be built? Where should this federal investment be made? And in fact, there was a bit of a food fight between Berkeley and the newly created Brookhaven National Lab as to who should get the next big machine. Brookhaven was created after the war as a national lab for the scientists basically from the Ivy League universities who'd been involved in the war effort. It's in New York on Long Island. The original siting criteria was that the laboratory site had to be within a 1-hour drive of the train that connected Boston with Princeton. So that gives you an idea of who the proponents were. If any of you are really knowledgeable of geography, you'll realize that Brookhaven is more than 2 hours from that train line. So that's kind of an interesting story. The siting for Brookhaven was led by a fellow by the name of Norman Ramsey, who was a physicist who won the Nobel Prize in Physics for the development of nuclear magnetic resonance, which is the technique that's more commonly known today as MRI. So if anyone's ever known anyone or had an MRI scan, it's that technique that was developed actually as a spin-off from the Second World War radar effort. And Ramsey was associated with that, and he was involved in the siting decision, was scouting for sites. They picked a site that they thought was perfect, which was near Rikers Island. It was another island in closer to New York. But for various reasons, that was not available. The military wasn't quite prepared to give it up, and some of the scientists were a little bit nervous that it might be too small, because even though it was big enough for something like this, they had ideas about where this was going to go. And so in the end, a last-minute change was made to go to something called Fort Upton, which was an Army base further out on Long Island. And when Norman Ramsey drove out there with his wife to scout it and see what it, whether or not it would work as a location, according to the official history of Brookhaven, so it must be true, she burst into tears and said, "I can't possibly spend my summers here. It's too far away from the city." But despite that, Brookhaven was established and then immediately began competing with Berkeley for the 1 billion volt machine. The AEC made the decision to build it at Brookhaven because they wanted to use that as one of the kind of starting points for building an institution around it, a lab around it. So Brookhaven was building the Cosmotron and also a larger graphite reactor similar to the one at Oak Ridge. And that was intended to give it its kind of major scientific facilities and define its research agenda. However, Berkeley, and in particular Lawrence, didn't want to give up on the idea of a billion-volt machine, and in a sort of classic horse trade made a deal around Los Alamos. The University of California had operated Los Alamos during the war. They did not really want to be involved in operating a lab whose primary function was the design of nuclear weapons and planned to pull out. The AEC wanted to retain the University of California. So the University of California said, okay, we'll run Los Alamos for you, but only if we get one too. And so the Bevatron was built as well, and those two machines kind of competed with one another. In addition to the Cosmotron, and this when it was built cost $8.7 million, which would be about $100 million in today's dollars. So it was a fairly significant investment. And in comparison, Lawrence's first cyclotron, the 4-inch version, cost about $25. So things had scaled up considerably. And just to give you an idea of where things are today, at Brookhaven just recently they've dedicated a new synchrotron, which is for different purposes, but operates on the same principles, called the National Synchrotron Light Source, and that costs just under $1 billion, $912 million. So these machines have continued to get more capable and also larger in scale and more expensive. And the Cosmotron was really the first of the new generation in 1953 and was a very productive research machine. This shows a picture of NSLs that was built at Brookhaven in the 80s. And this is now a machine, you can't even see the accelerator, it turns out. And that's because the purpose of the machines had changed. And this synchrotron was built not to do fundamental particle physics, but to take the radiation that's generated by the circulating charged particle beam and use it to study the structure of proteins and polymers and magnetic materials. And so it has a series of beam lines, which is what you see out on the floor here. It serves a very large and diverse community of physicists, chemists, biologists, materials scientists. A number of Nobel Prizes have been won for protein crystal structures that were solved here. And it's important to understand the structure of the protein if you want to understand its function, and that's particularly important in the development of new drugs and understanding disease. So NSLs was built in 1982, and the Advanced Photon Source is another example at Argonne National Lab in the 90s. It's an even larger machine than NSLs, serves an even larger user community, but again, building on those same principles that were established going back to the Cosmotron in 1953. And there are a number of such facilities. There's the Fermi National Accelerator Lab near Chicago, which has operated primarily focused on high energy or particle physics, so staying the course in terms of some of the original ideas behind building these machines. There's a facility called the SLAC National Accelerator Lab at Stanford, and of course there's the Continuous Electron Beam Accelerator Facility at Jefferson Lab, not too far away. This shows the dedication, or the first light at the NSLS-2, and this is the wrong date because this was this year. It's 20 years off, just a small detail. And in the control room, you can tell that it's not 1995 because there's flat panel displays. That's the giveaway. That and the clothing is sometimes a hint as well. That replaces the NSLs. So the reason that these machines have continued to grow in scale and cost is because they've continued to grow in terms of their scientific utility. And it's a good example of a combine of what you might call market pull and technology push. And in this context, what I mean when I say market pull is there are compelling scientific problems that are demanding more sophisticated machines. There is no way that we can solve the structure of proteins that may have tens or hundreds of thousands of atoms in them without something like a synchrotron or the coherent light source at Stanford University. You just don't have enough X-rays in the X-ray tube in your doctor's office in order to get down to that level of detail in a protein. Similarly, if you're trying to explore the frontier of high energy physics, the frontier of high energy physics has been moving to successively higher and higher energies as we go deeper and deeper into not just the nucleus, but into the particles that comprise the nucleus. So there's been a strong driver from the point of view of the pressing scientific problems of the day that has driven towards larger and more complex machines. But the other component is the impact of technology. And sometimes it takes the form of a technology that must be developed to build the facility. And there's been many examples of that where, you know, the science push drives the community to find a technical solution tailored to their needs. But oftentimes it's from technological developments elsewhere. So, for example, I mentioned the fact that magnetic resonance imaging came out of the war effort for radar. Well, the development of radar, of course, got a big boost, having played a major component in determining the outcome of the war in Europe with the Battle of Britain. And there were substantial investments in the technology that in turn enabled the development of new accelerators. Because it turns out you need that high energy, high frequency, high power radio frequency in order to drive the accelerator. So that was an example of a technological possibility from outside the field that helped propel the technology and make possible the sorts of machines that were being built. So it was sort of as I said, a bit of a push and pull. This is another example of a new technology that was really developed largely by the community building these machines. So this is a picture of the continuous electron beam accelerator facility down the road at Thomas Jefferson that was built in the 90s. And what you see in the photograph is what's called a cryomodule. And this is basically a refrigeration unit for the accelerator. So if you looked at the Cosmotron, if you peeled away all the stuff around it, what you found inside of it was copper and some cooling water. So you're feeding electrical energy into the copper to create electromagnetic fields that would accelerate the particles. And most accelerators operate on the same principle as the old style TV tubes. Those of probably everyone remembers before flat panels, there were these big, bulky, heavy things that had this big vacuum tube. And it was a particle accelerator. It's called a cathode ray tube. It was an electron accelerator. So it had an electron beam, and then it used electric fields to steer that electron beam around so that it could paint a picture on the screen. The screen had phosphors on it, so when the electron beam hit it, it would light up. And then you could scan that electron beam 60 times a second back and forth across the screen and make a picture. And that's how a TV set worked. It was an electron accelerator. Well, this is another electron accelerator, but it needs to get the higher energy. And so it's not using copper structures, it's using superconductors. And superconductors are something that was actually discovered at the beginning of the 20th century in Holland, in Leiden. And the material in here is niobium, which when you cool it down to close to absolute zero, conducts electricity with no losses. So this is a big advantage if you're building an accelerator, because those big machines have a big electric bill. And most of that electricity goes into the copper and comes back out again in the form of heat in the cooling water. So if you can get rid of the resistance, you know, it'll be more cost effective, which means you can more easily get the high energies. And this is a technology that was developed by the community of people interested in building these machines. Now, having done that, there are other things that you can use it for. So a sort of related technology is the use of superconductivity for magnets. So for example, the LHC at CERN has superconducting magnets in it, which allows you to get a very high magnetic field. It's the same superconducting magnets that are used in magnetic resonance imaging machines. So if you've ever seen one of those machines where someone's on a kind of a platform and gets slid into this large sinister-looking object, that sinister-looking object they're getting slid into is a superconducting magnet. And a lot of the work developing that technology was piggybacking on the efforts of people trying to build these accelerators. And it turned out to have this unexpected value in other areas. So I've been talking a little bit about the accelerators. I want to get back to the reactors, which was the other big science facility that sort of came out of the Manhattan Project. So at Oak Ridge, we had the graphite reactor in 1943. I showed you a picture of that. In 1965, we switched on something called the high flux isotope reactor. And that's a photograph of it. It still operates today. It's a very capable facility. You can see the kind of eerie blue glow of the Cherenkov radiation that's emitted from the fuel element. It has a single fuel element in the core. And this is what it looks like after the reactor's been shut down. It's still pretty radioactive, so it's in a swimming pool of water so that the people working on it are shielded. So that's changing out the core. This reactor was actually, its original purpose was to kind of continue the tradition of Lawrence in terms of the discovery of new elements. And the reason it's called the high flux isotope reactor is it was optimized for the production of heavy elements using the bombardment of neutrons in order to create new elements not found in nature. And in the 60s, there was a lot of interest in moving further down the periodic table. And that meant a special type of reactor, and HFIR was really optimized for doing that. It's actually not the only thing we do with it, but that was the original driver. And in fact, just recently, we've been using HFIR to produce berkelium, one of those elements that was discovered by Lawrence and Glenn Seaborg, the chemist. And then that berkelium gets shipped to Russia, where it's irradiated with a calcium beam and an accelerator, and we've made for the first time a new element, element 117. So even today, this pursuit of understanding the periodic table continues, supported by facilities such as HFIR. Now, the scale of these facilities is starting to get pretty big. So I told you the NSLS-2 cost about $1 billion. The high flux isotope reactor, if you built it today, would be well over $1 billion. So at a certain point in time, there is a need to really move beyond national boundaries if you're going to finance these type of things. And this is one of the examples. So this is a sister facility to Oak Ridge's reactor called the high flux reactor, which is in Grenoble in France. It's actually a European facility that was originally conceived as a project that the French and Germans could work on, since they were sort of still in the 60s trying to heal the wounds of the Second World War, basically. And de Gaulle and Konrad Adenauer, the Chancellor of Germany, wanted to find some cooperative projects that they could work together on. And one of the cooperative projects became CERN, the high-energy physics lab that was built in Switzerland. And another one became this Institut Laue-Langevin that started out as a French-German facility. The UK joined, and now most of the European countries belong. So up until this point, the story that I've been telling has been pretty US-centric. Partly that's because that's the story I know best. But partly that's because up until sometime around when CERN and the ILL were getting going, the US really dominated the scientific fields that required the use of major facilities, partly because it's a large, wealthy country, partly because following the Second World War, there was a recognition of the importance of investments in science for both national security and economic development, and partly because it took a while for others to get their act together. But the Europeans began getting their act together, building facilities like CERN and the ILL. This shows an example of a different sort of collaboration. So the spallation neutron source uses those same cryomodules that you see at JLab, slightly different because it's a different sort of accelerator. We're accelerating protons instead of electrons. It was completed in 2006. It was a partnership between national labs, so it wasn't just built by Oak Ridge, but there were 6 Department of Energy labs. Jefferson Lab was responsible for the cryomodules, not surprisingly, but we had involvement from Argonne National Lab in Chicago, Brookhaven National Lab in New York, Los Alamos, and Berkeley. And so it would cost $1.4 billion, so it was sort of affordable within a US context investment in science, but required leveraging a large number of institutions. And there's now a European facility of similar scale that's being built in Lund in Sweden and will be completed in about 2020, give or take. So I mentioned CERN. And this shows a picture of the Large Hadron Collider. So there are superconducting magnets in that of the same type that are in your everyday around-the-corner MRI machine. The LHC built on previous generations of machines and, of course, attracted a lot of attention recently with the discovery of the Higgs boson, which had been predicted but never observed. And in some sense, the LHC was a machine designed to observe that new particle. So it was a good thing that it did, since people might have been a little bit annoyed otherwise. So it does beg the question, though, if these things are getting more complex, larger and larger teams, you went from 10 to 60 between 1932 and 1939, and now you're talking thousands by the time you get to some scale of something like CERN. What's motivated it? And I alluded to that a little bit, but there was a critical kind of analysis that was done following the Second World War, which was a little bit unique in that you had these 2 new inventions, radar and the atomic bomb, that had been arguably fairly decisive in the war. As I said, radar certainly played an important role in ensuring that Britain didn't fall. Without it, you can make an argument that the Battle of Britain, as the German bombardment was known, might well have, totally destroyed that country. And obviously, the atomic bomb, not without controversy, but it brought an end to the war in Japan with very likely considerably less loss of life than would have been the case otherwise, if you look at the projections of what a full-scale invasion of Japan would likely have meant in terms of loss of life on both sides. And the reason it was a little bit unusual is there had been, over human history, there are lots of examples of new technologies being important. You can go back to the example of, Archimedes with parabolic mirrors lighting the opposing ships on fire, or the very important discovery of timekeeping, really, told in, some of you have probably seen the PBS documentary Longitude, about discovering how to accurately measure time in order to find your position. And that was the British Navy that was doing that. It was driven by military interests. The difference, I think, in the Second World War was the really close proximity between discovery, deployment, and military impact. That was quite unique. The idea that in the 30s, the chain reaction associated with the fission of uranium was discovered by Otto Hahn and Otto Frisch and Hahn. And within a decade was turned into something that was usable with the specific intent of influencing the outcome of the war was kind of remarkable. And needless to say, people kind of noticed. And in 1945, Vannevar Bush wrote a famous paper called The Endless Frontier. And he described scientific progress as one essential key to our security as a nation, to our better health, to more jobs, to a higher standard of living, and to our cultural progress. And what he posited in this paper was that the war effort had drawn on discoveries in fundamental science, that dated back, in some cases, decades. Radar drew really on the understanding of electromagnetic phenomena that was late 19th century innovation, and Maxwell's equations and so forth. And, the nuclear science was yet more recent. But Bush argued that we've essentially depleted the reserve of new fundamental understanding. And if we don't replenish it, we're not going to be able to propel our economy and also, in parallel, our military forward. So he laid out an argument for a larger government role in research than had been the case prior. And in fact, it was that argument that led to the creation of the National Science Foundation that was proposed. There was a little bit of political controversy. It took a couple of years, but by the end of the 40s, the NSF was created. The Atomic Energy Commission, I already mentioned, was created. It was doing a lot of the investment in physical sciences. You had, of course, Sputnik, and the response that ultimately led to the space race and the creation of NASA also drove a lot of development. So there was a large investment on the part of the federal government, and partly it was motivated by the Cold War and the feeling that technology had been decisive in the Second World War and may well be decisive in the standoff with the Soviet Union. But along the way, there were a lot of byproducts. So, for example, if you look at the computers as we know them today, a lot of the work in developing semiconductors, of course, the integrated circuit came out of the transistor, that came out of Bell Labs. It was kind of a fundamental discovery of materials science, but turning it into a real workable technology actually required the investment that was largely driven for military reasons. And of course, you had things like DARPA, which led to the creation of GPS and the internet. It was originally called ARPANET, Advanced Research Projects Agency, that was part of the Department of Defense. So GPS was designed as a targeting system for missiles. And it was only after it had been deployed for a while that the switch was flipped that allowed everyone to go out and, now you can get it in your watch. So there are a number of examples now where you can see how innovations that were seeded by government research made their way out into private sector and were used in ways that were never anticipated. The original designers of ARPANET wanted to make a communication system that was robust against nuclear attack. That led to the whole architecture of the internet. It was designed so there was no way you could take it down because it had so many nodes that no matter what got destroyed, there was always some pathway for information. Amazon.com was not in their research plan. And GPS, the inventors of GPS were interested in targeting. They weren't terribly interested on some device that you could put on your bicycle that would, tell you how far you went and how fast. So you can't always predict, but actually if you read what Bush laid out in that paper, The Endless Frontier, he was very aware of sort of both elements. The fact that development of the economy required innovation. He was way ahead of his time because in a lot of the economic work that's been done since then, for the US, approximately 50% of the real growth in gross domestic product since 1945 is due to new technology. And if you look at the industrial and commercial fields which the US dominates, the things that haven't been offshored to Mexico or China or the Philippines, they tend to be those things where there's a strong innovation component in things like computing, aerospace, and so forth. So it has been very important for our development as a nation. And in fact, other countries have figured that out. And that's why, as I said, this story may have started out as US investments in science and research. But as others started to look at that model, and the miracle of compound interest, if your growth rate is 1% higher because you've got a more innovative society and then you compound that over decades, it makes a huge, huge difference in your standard of living. not to mention the effects on human health associated with the discovery of new drugs and understanding disease. So, a more recent example is CERN, shown here, had a problem because there's large volumes of data generated by these experiments, and they've got thousands of researchers distributed around all the world. They had to find some way to communicate with them, and that's why in 1989, Tim Berners-Lee invented a way of sharing that information, which became the World Wide Web. He invented HTTP, HTTP:// that's his fault. And also the very positive things that have happened about that. But it was originally conceived as a way of automated sharing of information across a large distributed scientific effort, not so that you could look at cat videos in your pajamas. I talked about the superconducting magnets and the isotopes, but the isotopes that I talked about primarily were those new elements, californium, berkelium, and so forth. When you looked at Lawrence's original idea for the cyclotron, though, he was very aware of the possible medical applications. His brother was a doctor. In fact, those were some of the first people he went to try and get funding to build the cyclotrons. Now, cyclotrons are actually now, in any major urban medical center in the US, there will be a cyclotron because it's used to produce the isotopes for PET. So PET CT scans, positron emission tomography, is used for imaging, and that requires a short-lived isotope and a compact cyclotron that works on exactly the same principle as that 1939 machine that all those guys were sitting on, is the way that you do that. Neutrons, of course, you heard about how neutrons are used to study materials, understand where the atoms are and how they move. Essentially the same thing we're doing with X-rays, with the synchrotrons. There are some new types of major facilities that have come into the fore, so it's no longer just accelerators and reactors. One example is supercomputers. So this shows a machine called Titan, which is the second fastest computer in the world. The fastest is in China. Titan was #1, but that's in computing business, these things change every 6 months. And this is now a machine that's a sufficiently large resource that it requires that same type of investment and multidisciplinary team in order to use. So this is used to solve the most difficult computational problems, modeling climate change, trying to model the structure of proteins. You can see it on the pictures on the side of the machine. So there's pictures of climate change, protein structure, the core of a nuclear reactor, exploding supernova, problems that you would not be able to solve without thousands and thousands of processors. It actually uses, for its main computational horsepower, the same chips that are used in graphics cards for video games, because it turns out those are the most energy efficient way to do your calculations. So we're piggybacking on the gaming industry. And just like the big accelerators and the reactors, these operate in the same sort of model, which is generally that if you're going to come and do research and it's published in the open literature, there's no charge. That's what the facility budget is for. If you want to use the machine to do something that's proprietary for your own private benefit, then you have to pay. But most of the research is open literature, scientific research. Let's see. What have we got here? Okay, we'll get onto that in a minute. So there are these different sorts of machines that have also moved into different fields. As I said, at the synchrotrons you see not just physicists, but chemists and biologists and medical researchers. You have, using the supercomputers, a similar mix. And in fact, probably the new frontier in terms of big science now is social science. And the reason is because of the explosion of data around us and the difficulty of dealing with, well, in analogy with big science, we now have big data. And big data is something which is, I think, going to transform a lot of fields that have not got that kind of hardware focus, maybe, of some of the physical sciences and even the biological sciences. But if you look at the sorts of things you can do, assimilating the vast amount of data that we're all generating, with our devices, and that all of our interactions in terms of human behavior, it's a very rich environment for social science. Just like some of the physical sciences, that sort of cuts both ways because it, raises interesting and important questions about privacy. But it's going to require that same scale of effort in order to pull this apart, because you're going to have people who understand the math, who understand the computer science, who understand, the particular area of application. And so whether it's, archaeology or trying to understand societal reactions to major upsets, it's going to be a big multidisciplinary team, and there's a lot of kind of complex hardware. But again, the problems of the day are demanding it. And certainly the supercomputers have enabled a new way of doing science. Science used to progress by an interplay between experiment and theory. We would have some idea about how the world worked. We would design an experiment that would test that. It would prove the idea was correct or prove it was incorrect, and then we'd iterate. We'd refine the ideas, we'd refine the experiments. Well, computational science adds a third approach. It's not quite like doing a measurement. But on the other hand, it doesn't rely on an actual understanding in a mathematical sense. You can replace, to some extent, the simplification in a mathematical model by just brute force doing the calculation. So it's become sort of a third leg, and it's possible, I think, that some of the data is going to become even a fourth way of doing things, where you can make massive number of observations and extract insight from it. There's been this amazing observation that Google knows better than the CDC when there's an influenza outbreak. And that's because people start typing in search terms, and they can 2 weeks before the CDC data says there's an influenza outbreak in Richmond, Google already knows that it's happening. Kind of a little bit more scary, Amazon can tell that a woman is expecting before she knows. Again, because of the sorts of products that she's looking for. So data allows you to understand things in new ways, and to take full advantage of it, you're going to require a different approach to doing science. The final example I have is a machine that's now under construction. This is the facility for rare isotopes beams that's being built at Michigan State University. It'll be finished in a couple of years. So just to make the point that this trend continues. This is a next generation accelerator for doing rare isotope experiments. So it's in the succession line from the cyclotrons, answering fundamental questions about nuclear structure and the origin of elements in the cosmos. So I think we can expect that this and its sister facilities will continue to make contributions to the understanding of science. But I think there's also been a pretty good track record in terms of doing things that are impactful in terms of people's daily lives as well, and I would expect that to continue also. So I think with that, I'll stop, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
In those cyclotrons, you're showing superconductors inside as for acceleration. What type of material are those superconductors made of?
Depends on the scheme. So if you look at the let's see, at the cryo modules in JLab or SNS, those are made out of niobium, so it's a metal. It's refractory metal, it's shiny, looks like chrome or something like that. And the way they're used is they're not made into magnets. They're used as resonators that you feed the energy in. And the way that I'm now going to try and explain how this works, and you can tell me whether or not I've succeeded. But the way that these sorts of accelerators work is it's essentially analogous to surfing. So if you think about how a surfer works, a surfer is on a surfboard on a wave, and the wave is moving in towards the shore. And the trick when you're surfing is you're always going downhill, but the hill is moving. So it sort of pushes you along. And that's essentially how you're trying to accelerate particles in a cavity like this, where the wave is now the electromagnetic wave that you're feeding in. These things operate at the same frequency as a cell phone, roughly, 805 megahertz. So there's a big thing called a klystron that generates it's the same thing that's used in an Aegis radar system, dumps it all into this cavity, which resonates in the same way when you hit a tuning fork. You know, the tuning fork is tuned to a particular frequency, so you just strike it and it'll hit that C. So this is tuned to the frequency of that RF power, so it fills up with these electromagnetic waves, and the charged particles surf along, and they go faster and faster and faster because they're always going downhill, effectively. So that's one sort of superconductivity. And this same principle is actually used in satellite communications. So there are satellites that use a different sort of superconductor that operates at higher temperatures than these operate at 271 degrees Celsius below zero. So at 2 degrees absolute zero. There's another class of superconductors called high temperature superconductors that can work at much higher temperatures, as the name implies. And so there are actually satellites that use them for that same resonance effect in communications using similar sorts of principles. So it's got real-world applications as well. In this case, the Large Hadron Collider also uses superconductors, but it uses the superconductors as magnets to steer the beam. And as the particles go to higher and higher energy, you need stronger and stronger magnetic fields to keep them on the right curvature. This is a circular machine. So if you think about a racetrack, you know, if you go into the corner too fast, you're going to fly off the racetrack. So you've got to have the right speed relative to the banking of the track and so forth, and loosely speaking, the magnets are the banking of the track that keep those particles from flying off. And we need to get to very high magnetic fields because the LHC goes to very, very high energies, really fast particles. All those cars want to fly off, so you need a very strong magnet to do that. And that's niobium-3 tin or niobium titanium. They're alloys. The niobium titanium is easier to work with, but it doesn't go to as high fields. So for the really highest fields, you have to use niobium-3 tin, which is a terrible material to work with, but works well at high fields. The high temperature superconductors that I mentioned that are used in satellite communications are not yet quite working for this kind of an application, but you know, maybe someday at CERN they'll go in and tear out all these magnets and put in high TC magnets and go to even higher energy. Who knows? It could work at some point in time. Yep.
So your premise is, and I agree with it, is that science and innovation leads to economic growth, and economic growth has to be fueled by the children of today that are studying science. Are you encouraged or discouraged by what you see in terms of kids' interest in science, and do you have thoughts on how we can ensure that this next generation of kids embrace science and embrace the innovation and economic growth that comes from that?
Well, you know, the famous quote relevant to this is that all kids are born scientists and we beat it out of them through the educational system. What's meant by that is, you know, kids are naturally curious, and you see this, and I see it